Clover
Please,
Mercer had
don't hurt
11
us.
seconds to
You're
make
coming
someone
with
see
me.
her before
Stay-
the man holding her wrist reached the parking lot. 11 seconds before he put her in a car and drove away from the only place her mother would know to look. 11 seconds to convince a stranger that the yellow dress, the whitened grip marks the rigidity in her 8-year-old shoulders, that all of it meant exactly what it looked like. She made the signal twice. Nobody stopped. But the third time, when her left hand rose to her sternum on the courthouse steps and her thumb tucked beneath 4 trembling fingers, a man in a black leather vest froze 3 steps from the bottom. And in the half second before he moved, Clover Mercer understood something she would carry for the rest of her life. Being saved doesn't always look like rescue. Sometimes it just looks like someone who refuses to look away. The morning had started with peaches. Wren Mercer had been running late the way she'd been running late every Thursday for the past 6 months since she'd taken the position in the Bartow County Courthouse Records Department. The job paid $12 more per hour than her previous work at the grocery distribution center, came with health insurance that actually covered dental, and required her to process paperwork that other people considered tedious, but that Wren found it almost meditative. Forms had structure. Forms had rules. Forms didn't change their minds or break promises or disappear at 2 in the morning without explanation. Forms were safe. She'd ironed Clover's yellow dress that morning while her daughter ate cereal at the small kitchen table in their apartment at 4127 Sycamore Mill Road, apartment 2B. The dress had white buttons down the front, slightly yellowed from too many washes, but Clover loved it anyway. She called it her Thursday dress because that was the day she wore it every week without exception. Children find comfort in rituals. Wren understood this better than most. The community center pickup worked the same way every Thursday. Clover walked from school to the Bartow County Community Center at 3:15. She did homework in the activity room until 5:30. At 6:30, Wren left the courthouse, drove 3 blocks, and collected her daughter. She always brought a peach from the vending machine in the basement of the records building. Always the same brand. Always slightly underripe, because that's how Clover liked them. It wasn't much of a routine, but it was theirs. What Wren didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that someone had been watching that routine for 11 weeks. Someone had memorized the timing, the patterns, the vulnerabilities. Someone had calculated exactly when a single mother would be trapped in a basement office processing audit paperwork, and exactly when her daughter would be standing on the community center steps waiting for a ride that wasn't coming for another hour. Warren Prescott was very good at calculations. He was 47 years old. Frameless glasses that caught the light in a way that made his eyes look kind. Khaki pants pressed with military precision. Polo shirts in muted colors that suggested neither wealth nor poverty, just competence. The kind of appearance that said, "I belong here," without ever having to prove it. For 9 years, Warren Prescott had been the director of New Horizon Youth Services, a foster care coordination agency that worked directly with the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services. He had passed every background check. He had accumulated every credential. He volunteered with Boy Scout Troop, 214 coordinated hospital visits for isolated seniors, answered calls on the county crisis hotline, and served on the Neighborhood Watch Committee. His entire life had been built on institutional trust. And for 9 years, Warren Prescott had been stealing from the state of Georgia by billing for children who didn't exist, collecting stipends for placements that had ended years ago, and using the foster care system designed to protect vulnerable children as his personal financial instrument. The total would eventually reach $517,000. But that number was still buried in billing records that nobody had thought to audit, in case files that nobody had thought to compare, in complaints that had been filed and forgotten and systematically erased from the institutional memory of a system that had stopped looking for problems a long time ago. Until 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks ago, an anonymous tip had triggered an audit request. That request had been routed through the Bartow County Courthouse Records Department, and the clerk who processed the initial paperwork, the one who logged the audit into the tracking system and assigned it a case number and sent it forward to the Regional D, FCS Office for Action, was a woman named Wren Mercer. Warren Prescott had learned this 4 days later. He had contacts inside the system, people who owed him favors, people he had paid, people who understood that certain kinds of information were worth money and that Warren Prescott always paid on time. When he found out that the audit request had been processed by a courthouse clerk named Ren Mercer, he did what he always did when a threat emerged. He researched, he calculated, he planned. Ren Mercer was a single mother, no extended family nearby, limited support system. She worked Thursdays until 6:30. Her daughter attended the Bartow County Community Center after-school program every Thursday afternoon. The daughter's name was Clover. She was 8 years old, and in Warren Prescott's experience, there was no faster way to neutralize a bureaucratic threat than to have leverage over the person creating it. The first Thursday, he had simply observed, driven past the community center, noted the timing, watched Clover walk up the steps at 3:22, backpack bouncing against her shoulder blades, yellow dress bright against the gray concrete. The second Thursday, he had introduced himself to the community center director, explained that he was a foster care professional looking for volunteer opportunities, handed over credentials that sparkled with institutional credibility. The third Thursday, he had started volunteering in the activity room, helping with homework, learning names, building rapport with the staff. By the fifth Thursday, nobody questioned when Warren Prescott talked to the children. Nobody noticed when he paid particular attention to the quiet girl in the yellow dress who always sat near the window and did her math problems with careful, deliberate strokes. By the eighth Thursday, Clover Mercer had started feeling uncomfortable. She couldn't explain it, not in words that adults would take seriously. It wasn't anything he did exactly. He never touched her inappropriately, never said anything that crossed obvious lines, never behaved in ways that would trigger the alarm bells adults were trained to recognize. It was just the way he looked at her, the way he seemed to know things about her schedule that she hadn't told him, the way he asked questions about her mother that felt less like friendly conversation and more like reconnaissance. Clover had tried to tell someone. 3 weeks for the Thursday that would change everything. She had approached the community center counselor, a woman named Mrs. Pemberton, who smelled like coffee and lavender and had kind eyes behind thick glasses. That new volunteer, Clover had said, "Mr. Prescott, he gives me a weird feeling." Mrs. Pemberton had smiled the patient smile of an adult who had heard this concern before and had learned to categorize it as childhood anxiety. "Mr. Prescott is a very nice man," she had said. "He works with foster children professionally. He's passed all his background checks. Sometimes new people make us nervous, but that doesn't mean they're bad. You'll get used to him." Clover had nodded. She had not gotten used to him. Instead, she had started watching. Children are better observers than most adults realize. They notice patterns that adults dismiss. They feel wrongness in ways that adult minds have been trained to rationalize away. And Clover Mercer, who had learned at a very young age that the world was not always safe and that adults did not always protect you, had developed instincts that most 8-year-olds never needed. 3 weeks before the Thursday that would change everything, Clover had been sitting on the community center steps waiting for her mother when she saw Warren Prescott in his car. The car was parked at the far end of the lot. The windows were down because the September heat was still oppressive in central Georgia. And Warren Prescott was talking on his phone in the voice of someone who thought no one was listening. Clover had listened. She had trained her ears to catch the words floating across the parking lot, and she had committed them to memory with the desperate precision of a child who understood on some level she couldn't articulate that this was important. The audit request came through records. I know who processed it. A pause, listening to whoever was on the other end. The paperwork goes back through the same office. Another pause. The woman has a daughter. Thursdays. Clover's heart had started pounding. That's why Jonah Bridwell didn't go anywhere. She didn't know who Jonah Bridwell was. She didn't understand what the audit request meant or why the paperwork mattered. But she understood the tone. She understood the calculation in his voice. She understood that this man was talking about her mother, about her schedule, about her. And she understood with the clarity that comes only to children who have learned to survive that no adult was going to believe her if she tried to explain. So she did the only thing she could do. She memorized every word, every pause, every inflection. She burned it into her memory the way she burned the spelling words before tests, the way she memorized her multiplication tables, the way she remembered the route from school to home in case she ever needed to walk it alone. The audit request came through records. I know who processed it. The paperwork goes back through the same office. The woman has a daughter. Thursdays, that's why Jonah Bridwell didn't go anywhere. She repeated it to herself every night for 3 weeks. She wrote it in her journal in code that only she understood. She carried it like a stone in her chest, heavy and sharp and waiting. And on the 11th Thursday, when Warren Prescott walked up to her in the community center activity room and said her mother had called that there was an emergency that he'd been asked to drive her to the courthouse, Clover Mercer was ready. Not ready to escape. She was 8 years old and he was 47. She weighed 62 pounds and he weighed 193. She couldn't fight him. She couldn't outrun him. She couldn't scream without him tightening his grip until her wrist bones ground together. But she could count, and she could signal. The community center. That was Landmark 1. The parking lot, Landmark 2. The sidewalk that ran along Main Street toward the courthouse square. Landmark 3. The post office. Landmark 4. The hardware store. Landmark 5. She counted each one as Warren Prescott walked her past them, his hand locked around her wrist with the casual firmness of someone who had done this before. The bank, Landmark 6. The courthouse steps, Landmark 7. And it was there on Landmark 7 that Clover Mercer raised her left hand to her chest and made the signal she had learned in a police officer's presentation at school the previous year. Palm facing out, thumb tucked into palm, 4 fingers folded down over the thumb trapping it. The rescue signal. The silent cry for help that was designed to be invisible to captors, but visible to anyone who knew what to look for. She held it for 3 seconds. Then she dropped her hand. A woman walked past, eyes fixed on her phone. A man in a business suit hurried toward the post office. 2 school board members deep in conversation about budget allocations moved past without breaking stride. Nobody saw. Clover waited 4 more steps. Then she raised her hand again. Thumb tucked. Fingers folded. 3 seconds. A group of teenagers laughing about something on social media. An elderly couple focused on each other. A mail carrier sorting letters without looking up. Nobody saw. Warren Prescott's grip tightened. He was 12 feet from the parking lot now. His car was a gray sedan, practical and anonymous, the kind of car that nobody remembered seeing. Clover raised her hand one more time, and Garrett Holloway froze on the 3rd step from the bottom. He was not the kind of man most people expected to notice a child in distress. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall and 238 pounds, with a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks and arms covered in tattoos that told stories most civilians couldn't read. He wore a black leather vest with patches that identified him as the president of the Vidalia chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. His boots were scarred from 22 years of riding. His knuckles were scarred from things he didn't talk about. He had come to the Bartow County Courthouse that Thursday afternoon to file vehicle registration paperwork for 2 chapter bikes. Mundane business. The kind of errand he handled personally because he had learned over 2 decades in the Marines and 19 years wearing a Hells Angel patch that paperwork was where problems hid. He was 3 steps from the bottom when the movement caught his peripheral vision. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, yellow dress with white buttons ironed flat that morning by someone who cared. White canvas sneakers with a small sunflower drawn on the left toe in red marker. Walking beside a man in khaki pants and a polo shirt. The kind of man whose appearance screamed harmless so loudly that it made Garrett's jaw tighten. The girl's left hand came up, rested against her sternum, her thumb folded into her palm, 4 fingers curled over it, trapping it. 3 seconds, then her hand dropped. Garrett's own hand went to the courthouse railing, not for balance because something had just hit him in the chest with the force of a memory he carried every day, every hour, every minute of his life. A name, tattooed on the inside of his left wrist in careful black script. Ethan. March 14th, 2007. He watched for 4 more seconds, counted the grip on her wrist tight enough that the skin around the man's fingers had gone white, counted the rigidity in her shoulders, the posture of an 8-year-old who was holding herself together through sheer will, counted the way her head turned, fractionally scanning the courthouse square like she was looking for anyone at all who might be paying attention. On the 5th second, Garrett Holloway came down the last 3 steps. He did not run. He did not shout. He moved the way 22 years of combat training and explosive ordnance disposal had taught him to move towards something dangerous. With purpose. Without theater. Warren Prescott was 15 feet from the post office parking lot when Garrett fell into step beside them. Natural, easy, like a distant relative who'd been parking his truck around the corner and just happened to cross paths at the right moment. "Hey," Garrett said. His voice carried the measured warmth of someone asking for directions. "That your little girl Warren Prescott's head turned." His smile went up immediately. Practiced, professional. The smile of someone who had answered this question before and knew exactly how to make it go away. "My niece Prescott," said smoothly. "Thursdays are our day, ice cream and the park. She's at that age where everything's a production. You know how it is." He said it with the patient tolerance of a tired uncle. The kind of line that worked on teachers, on social workers, on the school board members who had walked past 90 seconds ago and chosen to believe it. Garrett looked at Clover. Her eyes were dark and wide and filled with something Garrett recognized from 17 years of sitting in DFCS waiting rooms and reading case files and learning the specific way terror looked on a child's face when the adults had stopped listening. "I see you, sweetheart," Garrett said quietly, dropping his voice so only she could hear it. "I see your signal." Clover Mercer's eyes filled with tears. She did not cry, but her left hand, the one Prescott wasn't gripping, came up again, slower this time, and pressed flat against her chest. Not the signal anymore, just her palm over her heart, like she was checking to make sure it was still beating. Garrett's jaw tightened. He looked back at Warren Prescott, whose smile had gone rigid at the edges. "You know what?" Garrett said. His tone was still friendly, but there was something underneath now. Something that Prescott's survival instincts were starting to register as a problem. "I've got a granddaughter about this age, and when she's scared, she gets real quiet, real still, just like your niece here." He let that sit for 2 full seconds. "So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to think real careful about your answer. Is this your niece?" Prescott's hand tightened on Clover's wrist. A flash of calculation crossed his face. The math of a man trying to decide if the person in front of him knew enough to be dangerous or just enough to be an inconvenience. "I don't know what you think you saw," Prescott said. His voice had dropped the warmth now. "But you need to step back before this becomes a legal issue. I'm a licensed foster care coordinator. This child is in my professional care and you're interfering with what." Garrett interrupted. His voice hadn't risen. It had gotten quieter. The kind of quiet that made the courthouse square feel smaller. "With you walking her toward a car she doesn't want to get into, with you gripping her wrist hard enough to leave marks, with the fact that she's been making a distress signal for the last 30 seconds and you're pretending not to notice." Clover made a small sound, not a word, just a broken exhale that hit Garrett like a punch to the chest. He knelt, right there on the sidewalk, 3 feet from the post office parking lot, in front of 11 people who were still walking past like nothing was happening. He went down to Clover's level, and he held out his left hand, palm up, the inside of his wrist facing her, the name Ethan in script, the date, the weight of 17 years of grief compressed into 9 characters. "You did everything right," Garrett said. His voice was impossibly gentle. "That signal you made, that's why I'm standing here. Nobody's taking you anywhere." "You hear me, nobody?" Clover looked at the name on his wrist. She didn't know what it meant, but she understood in the way children sometimes understand what adults think they're hiding, that this man had carried something heavy for a very long time, something that had broken him and rebuilt him into the kind of person who noticed things other people missed. She decided to trust the weight. "He's not my uncle," she whispered. The words came out cracked and small and trembling. 3 weeks of terror, finally finding release. "I don't know him. He said my mom sent him to pick me up from the community center. She didn't. I tried to tell the counselor. 3 weeks ago, he gave me a weird feeling. She said he's a nice man. He volunteers every Thursday. He knows my mom's name. He knows where she works. He knew I'd be waiting." Her voice broke. Garrett's hand closed into a fist at his side. 3 weeks ago," Clover continued. The words were spilling out now in the desperate rush of someone who'd been holding them too long. "I heard him on the phone in his car. I was on the community center steps. He said," she closed her eyes, drew the words up from the place where she'd kept them buried. "He said the audit request came through records. I know who processed it." Then he listened. Then he said, "The paperwork goes back through the same office." Then he said, "The woman has a daughter Thursdays." Then he said, her eyes opened, dark and clear and burning with something that looked like defiance. Then he said, "That's why Jonah Bridwell didn't go anywhere." She looked directly at Warren Prescott. "I memorized it, every word, because I knew it was bad, and I knew nobody would believe me unless I remembered it exactly." The courthouse square went very quiet. Warren Prescott's face had drained of color. Not the look of a man caught in a misunderstanding. The look of a man who had just heard a name he never expected to hear from an 8-year-old's mouth. Garrett stood slowly, his full height, 6 feet 3 inches of barely contained violence, wrapped in the discipline of a man who had learned exactly how much damage impulsive action could cause. "Jonah Bridwell," Garrett said quietly. The name hit the September air like a detonation, because Garrett Holloway had been building a file on New Horizon Youth Services for 14 months. Quietly, methodically. The way a man who had learned to read case files and track patterns did when something in his gut told him that an organization handling vulnerable children and never generating complaints was an organization that made complaints disappear. Jonah Bridwell's name was in that file. A 16-year-old who had filed a formal DFCS complaint in March 2021 alleging abuse during his placement under Warren Prescott's care. A complaint that had been logged, assigned to intake, and then administratively set aside pending additional documentation that was never requested and never received. A complaint that had vanished into the institutional machinery of a system that had stopped looking for problems a long time ago. "You want to tell me about Jonah Bridwell?" Garrett asked. Prescott's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. The recognition that the man in front of him knew a name he shouldn't know. That the 8-year-old girl he'd been trying to leverage had just connected dots he'd thought were buried forever. "I don't know what this child has told you," Prescott said. His voice had taken on the measured cadence of someone trained in trauma-informed communication. "But I'm a licensed professional. I've worked with DFCS for 9 years. I've passed every background check, and if you don't step aside right now, I will have you arrested for harassment and false imprisonment." Garrett pulled his phone from his vest pocket. He didn't break eye contact with Prescott. He pressed 3 buttons. The call connected on the second ring. Ironside Garrett said, "I need you at the Bartow County Courthouse. South steps right now. Bring everyone you can reach in the next 10 minutes. And call Nora Kendrick. Tell her I've got a foster care coordinator trying to walk away with a child who just told me about Jonah Bridwell." A pause, then a voice on the other end. Gravelly, steady, the voice of a man who had spent 22 years as a county sheriff's detective and knew exactly what that name meant. "We're rolling." The line went dead. Garrett looked at Warren Prescott. "You're not going anywhere," he said. "You're going to stand right here with me and this little girl until the people who actually care about her safety show up. And then you're going to answer a whole lot of questions about how a licensed foster care coordinator knows exactly where to find an 8-year-old on a Thursday afternoon." Prescott's jaw tightened. His hand was still locked around Clover's wrist. "This is kidnapping," he said. "You're holding me against my will." "That's a felony." "You're welcome to call your attorney," Garrett said evenly. "The FBI is going to want to talk to them anyway." The word FBI landed. Prescott's face changed. Just for a second. The mask slipped and something underneath showed through. Not a predator caught in a trap. A man who had been running calculations for 9 years and had just realized the math had finally caught up to him. Clover pulled. Not hard, not dramatically. Just a small testing tug on her trapped wrist. The movement of a child who had been holding still for 11 minutes and was now finally starting to believe she might not have to anymore. Prescott's grip tightened reflexively. 4 whitened crescents pressed deeper into the back of her hand. Garrett's voice dropped to something that made the September air feel 10 degrees colder. "Let her go." Warren Prescott, licensed foster care coordinator, Boy Scout, Troop 214 Leader Hospital Volunteer Coordinator, Neighborhood Watch Captain, Crisis Hotline Volunteer, a man whose entire life had been built on institutional trust and community standing, looked into the eyes of a Hells Angels president and understood finally that there were some things a clean background check couldn't protect you from. His hand opened. Clover stepped back, stumbled slightly. Garrett's hand steadied her shoulder. Gentle, careful. The touch of someone who knew exactly how fragile trust was when it had been shattered and was only just beginning to rebuild. "You're okay," he said quietly. "I've got you." And for the first time in 11 minutes, Clover Mercer let herself believe it. The sound started low, distant, like thunder building on the horizon. Then it grew, a rumble that vibrated through the courthouse steps and rattled the windows of the post office and set off two car alarms in the hardware store parking lot. By the time the first Harley-Davidson turned onto Broad Street, the rumble had become a roar that made conversation stop and pedestrians freeze and Warren Prescott's face go the color of old newspaper. Garrett had made one call. That call had gone to Boyd Ironside Tatum, 57 years old, retired Bartow County Sheriff's Detective, 22 years on the force, a man who knew the Georgia DFCS complaint and audit system from the inside because he'd spent 2 decades watching it fail children in ways that kept him awake at night. Ironside had made 4 more calls. Within 18 minutes of Garrett's phone going back in his pocket, 34 motorcycles from the Vidalia home chapter were rolling through downtown Bartow. Within 47 minutes, the count had climbed to 113. Savannah sent 31, Augusta sent 27, Macon sent 21 wrong. When the call included the words foster care coordinator and child, certain members didn't ask questions. They just showed up. The formation pulled into the courthouse square in disciplined rows. Tight, smooth, practiced from years of riding together for causes that never made the news. They parked one by one in the overflow lot across the street, engines cutting off almost in unison, until the sudden silence after all that noise felt heavy and expectant. 113 men in black leather vests stepped off their bikes and stood there. Not moving, not shouting, simply present. Ironside came first, 57 years old, gray beard streaked with white, eyes that had seen too many case files close too early. He walked up to Garrett, glanced once at Clover, then looked at Prescott with the kind of cold professional assessment that came from 2 decades of reading guilty men's faces. This is him, Garrett confirmed. Clover, this is Ironside. He used to be a detective. He's going to help make sure you get home safe. Ironside knelt. Not as low as Garrett had. His knees didn't bend that way anymore, but low enough to meet Clover's eyes without towering over her. Sweetheart, he said gently, I need to ask you some questions. Is that okay? Clover nodded. Her hand was still pressed to her chest. The man who was holding your wrist, you said he told you your mom sent him. Did your mom actually send him, Mo? Clover's voice was stronger now, finding its footing. My mom picks me up from the community center at 6:30 every Thursday, after her courthouse shift ends. She's never late. She always brings me a peach from the vending machine. She didn't send anybody. Ironside's jaw tightened. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, the same notebook he'd carried for 22 years, even though he'd been retired for 3. You said you heard him on the phone 3 weeks ago. Can you tell me exactly what he said? Clover closed her eyes. When she spoke, the words came out in the careful, measured cadence of someone who had memorized something important and refused to let it slip away. He said the audit request came through records. I know who processed it. Then he listened. Then he said the paperwork goes back through the same office. Then he said the woman has a daughter. Thursdays. Then he said that's why Jonah Bridwell didn't go anywhere. The courthouse square went very, very quiet. 113 men in leather vests stood motionless, listening to an 8-year-old girl recite words that would destroy a man's life. Ironside looked up at Garrett. Something passed between them. The understanding that what this child had just recited from memory was not the confused fragment of a scared child's imagination. It was the exact phrasing of a man discussing how to neutralize an institutional threat by targeting the family member of the person processing his audit paperwork. Ironside stood. He turned to Warren Prescott, who was standing 3 feet from the post office parking lot with 113 Hells Angels between him and his car. Warren Prescott, Ironside said quietly, licensed foster care coordinator, director of New Horizon Youth Services. I know who you are. I know what you do. And I've known for about 14 months that something in your case files doesn't sit right. He took one step forward. Now I know why. Prescott's mouth opened, closed. The charm offensive that had worked on teachers and social workers and community center directors was visibly recalibrating, trying to find the right angle, the right words, the right approach to make this problem go away. I don't know what this child thinks she heard. He started, his voice taking on the patient, reasonable tone of a professional explaining a misunderstanding. But I can assure you, Jonah Bridwell Ironside interrupted. 16 years old when he filed a formal complaint with DFCS in March 2021. The complaint alleged abuse during his placement under your care. It was logged, assigned to intake, then set aside pending additional documentation. That documentation was never requested. The complaint was never investigated. And you kept billing DFCS for Jonah's placement stipend for 2 more years after he aged out of the system. Prescott's face went carefully blank. I'm not discussing confidential case files with $163,700. Ironside's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. That's how much you collected in fraudulent stipend payments for a child who was no longer in your care. And that's just Jonah. I've got a list of 2 more names in case files that don't match your billing records. Ghost placements. Children who exist on paper and nowhere else. He let that sit. The DFCS audit was triggered 6 weeks ago by an anonymous tip. The audit request was routed through the Bartow County Courthouse Records Department. Ren Mercer processed the paperwork. Clover made a small sound. Ironside's voice gentled. Ren Mercer, your mom. Clover nodded, tears streaming down her face now, not from fear anymore, from the overwhelming relief of finally being heard. She processes DFCS audit paperwork. Ironside continued, his eyes never leaving Prescott's. Which means she's the one who would have handled the initial routing for an audit into New Horizon Youth Services. And you knew that. You knew her schedule. You knew she worked Thursdays. You knew her daughter waited at the community center until 6:30. He took another step forward. You targeted an 8-year-old child because her mother processed paperwork that could destroy you. The courthouse square was silent. Silent except for the distant sound of a screen door and the courthouse flag snapping in the September wind. Then a voice cut through the quiet. Female. Sharp. Carrying the authority of someone who had spent 26 years making arrest decisions. That's enough for me. Detective Nora Kendrick, Bartow County Sheriff's Office, walked into the courthouse square with 2 uniformed deputies behind her. She was 52 years old, graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, eyes that had seen more than she'd ever wanted to and less than she needed to. She and Garrett Holloway had a 14-year working relationship that neither of them had ever described to anyone in terms that would fit a form. She had been a junior detective on the Ethan Holloway case in 2007. She had closed it at her supervisor's instruction. She had never fully made peace with that. She looked at Garrett now. He nodded once. She looked at Clover. Her expression softened in a way that most people who only saw her badge never got to witness. Then she looked at Warren Prescott, and her voice went flat and professional. Warren Prescott, you're being detained for questioning regarding allegations of child endangerment, attempted kidnapping, and financial fraud related to DFCS billing records. You have the right to remain silent. She read him his rights right there on the courthouse steps, while 113 Hells Angels watched in disciplined silence. While an 8-year-old girl in a yellow dress pressed her hand to her chest and finally let herself cry. Warren Prescott was taken to the Bartow County Sheriff's Office in the back of a patrol car at 6:14 p.m., his hands cuffed behind his back, his frameless glasses sitting crooked on his face. The drive took 7 minutes. He spent 6 of them staring out the window at the line of motorcycles following 3 car lengths behind, maintaining perfect formation. Engines rumbling like a promise that this wasn't over. At 6:22 p.m., while Prescott was being processed into holding, Clover Mercer sat in the courthouse annex conference room with a victim advocate, a glass of water she hadn't touched, and her mother. Ren Mercer had run 4 red lights getting from the records department to the courthouse square. She had arrived to find her daughter surrounded by men in leather vests and a detective she recognized from the hallways explaining that Clover was safe, that she'd done everything right, that the man who tried to take her was in custody. Ren had dropped to her knees on the courthouse steps and held Clover so tightly that the girl's ribs ached. And for the first time in 11 weeks, since the day Warren Prescott had started volunteering at the community center, and Clover had come home saying a new helper gave her a weird feeling, Ren Mercer let herself believe her daughter's instincts over a man's credentials. I should have listened, Ren whispered into Clover's hair, her voice breaking on every syllable. Baby, I should have listened. Clover's small arms tightened around her mother's neck. You're listening now, she said, and somehow that was enough. Garrett stood outside the conference room with Ironside watching through the small window in the door as mother and daughter held each other. He didn't go in. This wasn't his moment. His job had been to see the signal, to show up, to make sure the child who'd been counting landmarks, courthouse, post office, hardware store, bank, got to stop counting and start breathing. Ironside pulled a file folder from the messenger bag slung across his shoulder. He'd brought it with him. Of course he had. Garrett recognized it. The same folder Ironside had been building for 14 months. The one that held every inconsistency in New Horizon Youth Services case records that had made his detective instincts itch long after the badge came off. Jonah Bridwell's complaint is in here, Ironside said quietly. Filed March 17, 2021. The intake supervisor was Lorraine Ashby. She retired 6 months later on full pension. Hasn't responded to any contacts since. Garrett's jaw tightened, and the complaint was set aside pending additional documentation. Documentation that was never specified. Jonah was 16, no attorney, no guardian to advocate for him. It sat there until it was already buried. Ironside flipped to another page. Prescott made a $4,200 cash withdrawal 3 days after the complaint was logged. Only cash withdrawal in that account's 4-year history. Payment, Garrett said. That's what I think. But I can't prove it, not with what I have. Garrett looked back through the window at Clover, the little girl in the yellow dress who had memorized a phone conversation word for word because she knew at 8 years old that nobody would believe her unless she had proof. What about what she has? Ironside followed his gaze. An 8-year-old's memory of a phone conversation she overheard 3 weeks ago. A defense attorney will tear it apart. Then we find more. Ironside nodded slowly. Then we find more. The door to the conference room opened. Wren Mercer stepped out, her eyes red, her face streaked with tears she hadn't bothered to wipe away. But her spine straight, her voice steady. She looked at Garrett Holloway, at the leather vest, the tattoos, the size that should have been intimidating but somehow wasn't. You're the one who saw her, Wren said. It wasn't a question. Garrett nodded. Wren's hand went to her throat, touching the hollow where her pulse was still hammering. She made that signal 3 times, Wren said, her voice cracking. 11 people walked past her, and you were the only one who stopped. Garrett didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. The victim advocate appeared in the doorway behind Wren, a young woman with kind eyes and a clipboard full of forms that would need to be filled out before the night was over. Mrs. Mercer, we should continue the interview while everything's fresh. Wren nodded, but she didn't turn away from Garrett. Why, she asked. Why did you stop? The question hung in the September air. Garrett looked at her for a long moment, then he turned his left wrist. Let the light catch the ink. Ethan, March 14th, 2007. Wren's breath caught. I had a son, Garrett said quietly. He was 6 years old. He was in a foster care placement while I was deployed overseas. Something happened to him. Something that shouldn't have happened. And by the time I got home, he stopped. Some sentences couldn't be finished. Wren's hand covered her mouth. I've been looking for him ever since, Garrett said. Not Ethan specifically, but the child whose signal nobody sees. The one whose voice nobody amplifies. The one who's standing on a street corner, running out of options, waiting for anyone to notice. He looked toward the conference room, through the window, at the little girl in the yellow dress who was watching them with eyes that understood far too much for 8 years old. Thursday afternoon, Garrett said. I found your daughter. Wren was crying again, but differently now, not from fear or relief or guilt, from something deeper. Something that didn't have a name but felt like gratitude and grief and recognition all tangled together. Thank you, she whispered. The words inadequate. Everything was inadequate. But Garrett understood. He nodded once, then he turned to leave. Clover's voice stopped him. Mister. He looked back. She was standing in the conference room doorway now, small and fierce and still wearing the yellow dress that her mother had ironed that morning. The sunflower on her left sneaker was slightly smudged. The white buttons caught the fluorescent light. What was his name, she asked. Your son, Ethan, Garrett said. Clover was quiet for a moment, then she walked across the hallway, stopped in front of him, looked up into his face with the directness that only children possess. You didn't look away, she said. When everyone else did, you stopped. I did. Why? Garrett knelt. bringing himself to her level, the same way he'd knelt on the courthouse steps when everything was still uncertain and the outcome was still in question. Because 17 years ago, somebody looked away from my boy, and I promised myself that I would never do the same thing. Not ever, not to anyone. Clover considered this. Then she reached into the pocket of her yellow dress and pulled out something small. A river stone, gray and smooth and worn down by water until it fit perfectly in a child's palm. I found this last summer, she said, at the creek behind the community center. I've been carrying it ever since. For luck. She pressed it into Garrett's hand. I don't need it anymore, she said, because you found me instead. Garrett looked at the stone, felt its weight in his palm, the warmth of it from being carried in a child's pocket. His throat tightened. Thank you, he said, his voice rough. Clover nodded. Then she looked at him with eyes that saw too much. Mr. Prescott said nobody would believe an 8-year-old, she said. Before they put him in the car, he looked right at me and said it, like he was making a promise. Garrett's jaw locked. What did you say? Clover's chin lifted. I said, did you say that to Jonah too? The silence that followed was the kind that comes before storms break, or truths emerge, or the world shifts slightly on its axis. Garrett stared at this child. This 8-year-old girl who had memorized a phone conversation, counted landmarks, made a signal 3 times, and then thrown a name back in her captor's face like a weapon she'd been sharpening for 3 weeks. What made you think to say that, he asked, because I know he said it to Jonah, Clover replied. I could hear it in his voice that day, in the parking lot, when he said, that's why Jonah Bridwell didn't go anywhere. He said it the same way he said it to me, like it was a fact, like he'd proven it before. She met Garrett's eyes. He hurt Jonah, she said. I don't know how, but I know he did, and nobody believed Jonah either. That's why the man was so sure nobody would believe me. The stone was heavy in Garrett's palm. You're right, he said quietly. He did hurt Jonah, and nobody believed him. But you just made sure that changes. Clover nodded. I know, she said, not with arrogance, not with pride, just with the simple certainty of a child who had done the impossible and was only now beginning to understand what it meant. Wren appeared in the doorway. Baby, we need to finish with the advocate. Clover turned, then looked back at Garrett. Are you going to find Jonah? She asked. Garrett stood. Yes, good, Clover said. Tell him someone heard his name. Tell him someone remembered. Tell him he wasn't wrong to tell the truth, even if nobody listened. She paused. And tell him I'm sorry it took so long for anyone to believe him. Then she walked back to her mother, took her hand, disappeared into the conference room. The door closed. Garrett stood in the hallway of the Bartow County Courthouse Annex, holding a river stone that had been carried in a child's pocket for luck, listening to the distant rumble of 113 motorcycles idling in the parking lot, feeling the weight of a name on his wrist and a promise in his chest, and something that felt for the first time in 17 years like purpose instead of grief. Ironside appeared at his shoulder. She's something, that kid. Garrett nodded. Yeah, she is. He opened his hand, looked at the stone. We need to find Jonah Bridwell, he said. Tonight. Ironside pulled out his phone, already on it. The sun was setting over Bartow County, orange and red and gold bleeding across the sky like a promise or a warning. 113 motorcycles would disperse over the next hour, returning to Savannah and Augusta and Macon and all the towns in between. But they would be back when the call came, when it mattered. That was what family meant. Garrett walked out of the courthouse and into the September evening. The air smelled like motor oil and cooling asphalt, and something that might have been hope. Behind him, an 8-year-old girl was giving her statement to a victim advocate, describing every detail of the 3 weeks she had spent watching a predator and the 11 minutes she had spent in his grip. Ahead of him, somewhere in the darkening Georgia evening, a 22-year-old man named Jonah Bridwell was living a life that had been shaped by a complaint nobody believed and a system that had looked away. Garrett climbed onto his bike, started the engine, let the rumble settle into his bones. He didn't know what would come next, didn't know how deep this would go, or how many names they would find, or how much damage had been done in 9 years of institutional silence. But he knew one thing: an 8-year-old girl had made a signal, 3 times because she believed someone would see, and Garrett Holloway had seen. That was the beginning. That was the promise. That was everything that mattered. The sun finished setting, the streetlights came on. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, justice was finally starting to move. The Vidalia Hells Angels clubhouse sat on a stretch of County Road 12 7 miles outside town, where the pine trees grew thick enough to swallow sound, and the nearest neighbor was a hunting cabin that had been empty since 1994. The building itself was unremarkable, low brick construction from the 1970s, a gravel parking lot that could hold 60 vehicles, a hand-painted sign on the front gate that read private property in letters large enough to be read from the highway. By 7:30 that evening, the parking lot held 113 motorcycles, 3 pickup trucks, Ironside's 2004 Crown Victoria that refused to die, and a gray sedan that belonged to Detective Nora Kendrick. Inside the main room smelled like motor oil and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. A long table dominated the center of the space, scarred wood that had absorbed 2 decades of chapter business. The walls held photographs, rides, charity events, brothers who had passed, children who had been helped in ways that never made the news. Garrett Holloway stood at the head of the table. Around him sat the men who had dropped everything and shown up when the call came. Ironside with his case files, Gage Dempsey, 63, former Army combat medic who had brought the trauma kit he kept strapped under his rear fender and had examined Clover's wrist with a gentleness that made her mother cry. Harlan McBride, 49, former middle school counselor who had resigned in 2018 after reporting a student's abuse to administration and watching it get routed to the school board's legal team instead of FCS. Bite Sutton, 29, youngest full patch member, former IT contractor who could trace a financial paper trail faster than most people could spell fraud. And Anvil Craddock, 71 years old, founding member, a man whose own son had been placed in state foster care in 1994 and never located after the placement ended. Anvil hadn't spoken about that in 27 years. When Garrett had called and said what Prescott was, Anvil hadn't said a word on the phone. He had just shown up. But there was one more person in the room. She sat at the far end of the table, her legs dangling several inches above the floor, because the chairs were designed for men who weighed 200 pounds, not children who weighed 62. Her yellow dress was wrinkled now, the careful ironing from that morning undone by everything that had happened since. Her mother sat beside her, one hand wrapped protectively around her daughter's shoulder. Clover Mercer had been invited to a Hells Angels chapter meeting. It was unprecedented. In the 19 years since Garrett had taken over the Vidalia chapter, no child had ever sat at this table. No civilian had ever been present for operational planning. The rules existed for good reasons, reasons of security and liability, and the simple fact that some conversations needed to happen without outside ears. But Garrett had made the decision himself. This girl, he had told Ironside when the older man raised an eyebrow, is the most important witness we have. She memorized a phone conversation word for word. She counted landmarks while she was being walked to a car. She threw a name in her captor's face that connected to a complaint buried 3 years ago. If we're going to take this apart, she needs to know what we're doing, and she needs to be part of it. Ironside had considered this for a long moment. Then he had nodded. You're right. She earned that. Now Garrett looked around the table at the men who had assembled, at the files spread across the scarred wood, at the laptop Bite had positioned in front of him, its screen glowing with financial records that would eventually prove fraud exceeding $500,000, and at the 8-year-old girl who was watching everything with eyes that missed nothing. Warren Prescott Garrett began, 47 years old, licensed foster care coordinator, director of New Horizon Youth Services, 9 years with DFCS, Boy Scout troop leader, hospital volunteer, crisis hotline volunteer, clean background check, spotless reputation. He paused, and a predator who's been stealing from the state and targeting children for close to a decade. The room went quiet. Clover heard him on the phone 3 weeks ago, Garrett continued. He said the audit request came through records. He knew who processed it. He knew the paperwork went back through the same office, and he knew that office belonged to Ren Mercer. He looked at Clover's mother. Your office, he said. Your paperwork. Your daughter. Ren's hand tightened on Clover's shoulder. Ironside pulled documents from his folder. DFCS triggered an audit 6 weeks ago based on an anonymous tip. The tip flagged inconsistencies in New Horizon's billing records. specifically stipend payments for children who weren't in active placements. How much, Harlan asked. Ironside looked at Bite. Bite's fingers moved across his keyboard. Numbers scrolled across the screen. I've been tracing the financial trail for the past 3 hours, Bite said. New Horizons operating account shows monthly transfers of $4,200 to a personal account in Prescott's name, dating back to January 2017. He pulled up another window. That's $50,400 per year, times 7 years. His fingers tapped. $352,800 in personal transfers from a nonprofit operating account. That's embezzlement, Harlan said. That's just what I found in the operating account, Bite replied. There's more. He pulled up another screen. Jonah Bridwell, born June 3, 2004, placed with New Horizon Youth Services under Prescott's coordination from September 2019 through March 2021. Age during placement 14 to 16. He scrolled down. Here's where it gets ugly. According to FCS billing records, Prescott collected placement stipends for Jonah from September 2019 through August 2023. The room went very still. Jonah aged out in March 2021, Ironside said slowly. That's when he filed the complaint. And Prescott kept billing for him for 2 more years, Bite confirmed, at $1,850 per month. That's $22,200 per year, times 2.4 years. He looked up from the laptop. $53,000 in fraudulent billings for one child who wasn't even in the system anymore. Anvil Craddock stood up, walked to the window, stood there with his back to the room, his massive shoulders rigid with something that looked like barely contained violence. Garrett understood. Some math was too heavy to sit still for. Keep going, Garrett said quietly. What else? Bite pulled up another screen. There are 2 more names in the billing records with the same pattern. Children with case file numbers that don't correspond to active placements. One shows as aged out in 2020, but billing continued through 2023. The other, he stopped. The other has a social security number that comes back as never issued. Ghost placement, Ironside said. A child who never existed. Correct. Bite's voice had gone cold. And Prescott's been collecting stipends for this non-existent child since May 2018. That's 5 years at $1,850 per month. Another $111,000 in fraud. He looked up from the laptop. Total fraudulent billings across 3 ghost cases. $164,280. Add the personal transfers from the operating account. $352,800. That's $517,080 in documented theft from a system designed to protect vulnerable children. The silence in that room was the kind that came before storms broke, or justice arrived, or men decided to cross lines they couldn't uncross. Garrett chose justice. Where'd the money go? He asked. Bite pulled up another window. Bank records show several large purchases. A 2021 Airstream trailer, 27-foot, purchased for $83,700. Registered to Prescott's brother's address in Statesboro. He scrolled. 3.4 acres of undeveloped and on the Altamaha River. Alabama, purchased under a shell LLC called Riverbend Holdings. Purchase price $71,400. The LLC's registered agent is, he stopped. Warren Prescott. What else? Garrett's voice was quiet. 6 years of annual membership dues and green fees at Vidalia Country Club. Total $43,800. Bite looked up. He stole from children who had nothing, and he spent it on a trailer, land, and golf. Anvil turned from the window. His face was carved from stone. How much does Clover's family have? He asked. Ironside checked his notes. Ren Mercer's checking account holds $1,740. No savings, no family nearby. And Prescott's documented net worth approximately $2.1 million, Bite said, including the fraudulent assets. Anvil nodded once. Then we take it all back. But it was Clover who spoke next. Her voice was small in the room full of large men, but it carried. You said the land is on the Altamaha River. Everyone turned to look at her. Clover's eyes were focused on something far away, something 3 weeks old. A parking lot, a phone conversation. Words she had burned into her memory because she knew they were important. When he was on the phone, she said slowly, in the parking lot, he said more than what I told you before. There was another part. After he hung up, he thought he was alone, but I was still on the steps. She closed her eyes. He said the river property. That's where it stays, where no one will find it. The room went silent. Bite's fingers were already moving. 3.4 acres on the Altamaha River, he said. Coordinates pulling up now. He turned the laptop so everyone could see the satellite image. Dense trees, a small clearing near the water. No structures visible. Why buy land and leave it empty? Harlan asked. You don't, Ironside said. You buy it because you're planning to use it for something you don't want anyone to see. Garrett looked at Clover, the 8-year-old who had just provided the crucial piece of information that would break this case wide open. You remembered that, he said. After everything that happened today, you remembered a detail from 3 weeks ago. Clover met his eyes. I remember everything she said, because nobody believed me before. So we made sure I would have proof in case anyone ever asked. Garrett's throat tightened. Someone's asking now, he said. Clover nodded. I know. They reached the river property at 9:52 that night. 2 trucks with high beams cutting through darkness that smelled like river water and rotting leaves. Garrett in the lead vehicle, Ironside beside him, Gage and Harlan in the truck behind. Ren Mercer had wanted to come. Garrett had said no, had explained that what they might find could be evidence in a federal case, that chain of custody mattered, that having civilians present could compromise the investigation. What he hadn't said was that he didn't know what they would find, and that some things once seen couldn't be unseen. Clover had wanted to come too. This time Ren had said no, and for once Clover hadn't argued. The land was undeveloped, no structures, no utilities, just 3.5 acres of overgrown scrub and a small clearing near the water where someone had set up a fire ring. The fire ring was old, and years of ash built up in layers. Someone had been coming here regularly for a long time. They searched the clearing by flashlight. Gage found it first, a waterproof storage container, buried 18 inches deep under the fire ring, sealed with a combination lock that Ironside broke with a tire iron because they were well past the point of worrying about property damage. Inside, 3 file folders, each labeled with a child's name in Warren Prescott's careful handwriting, each containing documents that should have been in DFCS case files and weren't. Medical reports showing injuries that were never investigated. Photographs that made Garrett's stomach turn. Handwritten notes in Prescott's own writing detailing incidents he had never reported. Evidence of abuse, hidden in a fireproof container. Buried on land he owned through a shell company, preserved like trophies. The 3rd folder was labeled Jonah Bridwell. Ironside opened it with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside, along with the medical reports and the photographs and the handwritten notes, was a document that stopped everyone's breathing. A life insurance policy. Beneficiary Warren Eugene Prescott. Insured Jonah Andrew Bridwell. Policy amount $127,600. Date of policy February 4th, 2021. Date of Jonah's complaint March 17th, 2021. 6 weeks. Prescott had taken out a life insurance policy on a child in his care 6 weeks before that child filed a complaint that could have destroyed him. Ironside's hands were shaking when he closed the folder. He was going to kill him, Harlan said. His voice was hollow. Jonah filed the complaint. The complaint got buried, and Prescott was going to. We don't know, that Ironside interrupted. We can't prove intent. The policy was never paid out. Jonah is alive because someone got Jonah out, Garrett said quietly. Someone moved him before Prescott could finish what he started. Or Jonah ran, Gage said. He was 16, old enough to disappear. Garrett pulled his phone from his pocket. We need to find Jonah Bridwell, tonight. But even as he said it, he knew that finding Jonah was only part of what needed to happen next. Because somewhere out there, the people who had helped Warren Prescott bury complaints and hide evidence and look the other way for 9 years were still walking free. And one of them, a man named Russell Vance, was still working at DFCS. The call came at 10:47 that night. Garrett was back at the clubhouse, the evidence from the river property secured in a lockbox that would be handed over to Detective Kendrick in the morning. Bite was still tracing financial records. Ironside was on the phone with contacts in the Macon area, trying to locate Jonah Bridwell. Unknown number on the screen. Garrett answered. Mr. Holloway. A woman's voice. Elderly. Trembling. My name is Lorraine Ashby. I used to work for DFCS. I heard about what happened today. I need to talk to someone. Garrett's eyes met Ironside's across the room. I'm listening, he said. Not on the phone, Lorraine said. Can you meet me? There's a Waffle House on Highway 280. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I'll be there in 15, Garrett said. The line went dead. Lorraine Ashby was 71 years old. She sat in a booth at the back of the Waffle House with a cold cup of coffee and a manila envelope she kept touching, like she was afraid it would disappear. Her hands shook. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had finally reached the point where she couldn't carry it anymore. Garrett slid into the booth across from her. Ironside stood by the door watching the parking lot. Thank you for coming, Lorraine said. Her voice cracked on every word. I've been carrying this for 3 years. I didn't know how to. Start at the beginning, Garrett said gently. Lorraine nodded. She slid the envelope across the table. March 17th, 2021. Jonah Bridwell filed a formal complaint with DFCS alleging abuse during his placement under Warren Prescott's care. I was the intake supervisor who received it. Her hands twisted together. The complaint was detailed, specific. It included dates, incidents, witnesses, everything you would need to begin an investigation. She paused. My supervisor at the time was Russell Vance. When I brought Jonah's complaint to him, he told me to set it aside. Said it needed additional documentation before we could proceed. I asked what documentation. He said he'd let me know. She looked up at Garrett. He never did. What happened next? Garrett asked. 2 weeks later, Prescott came to the office. Had a meeting with Vance behind closed doors. An hour later, when Prescott left, Vance called me in and told me Jonah's complaint had been resolved internally. Said Jonah had emotional issues, a history of fabrication. Said the complaint wasn't credible. Her voice broke. I knew it was credible. I'd read it. I'd seen Jonah's face when he filed it. That boy was telling the truth. Why didn't you push back? Garrett asked. Not accusatory, just asking. Because I was 68 years old and 6 months from retirement, Lorraine said quietly. Because Russell Vance had the power to make my pension disappear. Because I convinced myself that someone else would catch it. That the system had safeguards. That one buried complaint wouldn't matter in the long run. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. I was wrong, and I've known I was wrong every single day for 3 years. She pushed the envelope closer. That's my personal copy of Jonah Bridwell's complaint. I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me knew this day would come, that someone would finally ask the right questions. Garrett opened the envelope. Inside was a 14-page document, handwritten in careful block letters, signed and dated by Jonah Andrew Bridwell. He read the first page. His jaw locked. This is evidence, he said. Yes. You held on to evidence of child abuse for 3 years. Yes. Her voice was barely a whisper. Why bring it to me now? Lorraine looked at him. Because I heard what you did today. I heard a Hell's Angel saw a little girl's signal on the courthouse steps and didn't walk past. And I realized, she stopped. I realized you did what I should have done 3 years ago. You saw something wrong and you didn't look away. Garrett closed the envelope. This goes to Detective Kendrick tonight. I know. You'll probably be questioned. Maybe charged. I know. Lorraine's hands were still shaking. I don't care anymore. I'm 71 years old. I've got enough money. What I don't have is the ability to look at myself in the mirror. Maybe this helps. But Garrett could see there was more. Something she wasn't saying. What else, he asked. Lorraine's face went pale. Russell Vance called me tonight. 2 hours ago. He knows Prescott was arrested. He knows the investigation is happening. What did he say? That if I talk to anyone, if I give anyone that complaint, he'll make sure my pension disappears. He'll make sure I'm prosecuted as an accessory. He said, she stopped. He said he has connections, people who owe him favors, people who can make problems disappear the same way they made Jonah's complaint disappear. Garrett leaned forward. Russell Vance is threatening you to keep quiet about evidence that could put Warren Prescott away for the rest of his life. Lorraine nodded. And you came anyway. Lorraine's chin lifted. Because an 8-year-old girl was braver than I've been for 3 years. She made a signal on the courthouse steps. 3 times, when nobody was watching, when nobody was helping. She kept trying anyway. She met Garrett's eyes. If she can do that at 8, I can do this at 71. Garrett stood. He looked down at the woman who had chosen a pension over a 16-year-old's safety and had spent 3 years drowning in that choice. You should have helped him when it mattered, Garrett said quietly. But you're helping him now. That counts for something. He turned to leave, then stopped. Russell Vance, he said. He's still at DFCS. Yes, regional supervisor. He was promoted last year. He's going down too, Garrett said. All of them, everyone who touched this. He walked out. Ironside followed. In the parking lot, Garrett handed the envelope to Ironside. Get this to Nora. Tell her Lorraine Ashby is willing to testify. And tell her Russell Vance is obstructing justice in real time. He threatened a witness 2 hours ago. Ironside took the envelope. This changes everything. With Jonah's original complaint and Ashby's testimony about how it was buried, we've got a pattern. We've got institutional corruption. We've got enough to destroy him, Garrett finished. All of them. His phone buzzed. Text from Byte. Found Jonah Bridwell. Make an address. He's alive. He's willing to talk. Garrett stared at the message for a long moment. Then he made a decision. We're not going to Macon, he said. Not yet. Ironside's eyebrow rose. There's someone else who needs to talk to Lorraine Ashby first, Garrett said. Someone who earned the right. It was nearly midnight when the gray sedan pulled into the clubhouse parking lot. Detective Kendrick had escorted Wren and Clover from the courthouse annex, where they had spent 6 hours giving statements and answering questions and waiting for news that never seemed to come. Now they were here, at the Hells Angels clubhouse, at midnight, because Garrett Holloway had called and said there was something Clover needed to see. Wren hadn't wanted to bring her. Clover had insisted. Inside, the main room had been cleared, the files put away, the laptops closed. Only Garrett and Ironside remained sitting at the long table with cups of coffee that had gone cold. And Lorraine Ashby, still in the same booth position she'd been in at the Waffle House, but now transferred to a chair at the end of the table, her hands still shaking, her eyes still red, waiting. Clover walked in first. She saw the elderly woman, saw the fear and the guilt and the 3 years of shame written across her face. And she understood, in the way children sometimes understand what adults think they're hiding, exactly who this woman was and why she was here. You're the one who got Jonah's complaint, Clover said. Not a question. Lorraine's breath caught. Yes, she whispered. And you didn't help him. No, I didn't. The room was silent. Clover walked forward, slowly, deliberately, the way she had walked past landmarks on the courthouse steps, counting each one, measuring the distance. She stopped 3 feet from Lorraine Ashby, looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much and understood even more. Why, Clover asked. The single word hung in the air. Lorraine's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I was scared, she said, her voice cracking. I was close to retirement. My supervisor told me to let it go. He said Jonah was lying. He said the complaint wasn't credible. And I believed him, because it was easier than fighting. Clover considered this. Jonah was 16, she said. He wrote 14 pages. He told the truth about what happened to him. And you read it, you knew it was true, yes, but you were scared, yes, of losing my pension, of being fired, of Russell Vance making my life difficult, she stopped, of everything. Clover was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made every adult in the room catch their breath. I'm 8 years old, Clover said. When I heard Mr. Prescott on the phone, I was scared too. I was scared for 3 weeks. Every Thursday when he looked at me, every time he smiled, every time he knew things about me he shouldn't know. She held up her left hand, but I still made the signal. 3 times. Even though I was scared, even though I didn't know if anyone would see, even though everyone kept walking past, her chin lifted. Jonah made his signal too. He wrote 14 pages. He told the truth. That was his signal. And you walked past. Lorraine was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. I know, she whispered, I know. Clover took 1 step closer. I'm not going to tell you it's okay, she said. Because it's not. Jonah needed help, and you didn't give it. That's not okay, she paused. But, the word hung in the air. You're here now with those papers ready to tell the truth. Lorraine nodded, unable to speak. Why, Clover asked. Because of you, Lorraine managed. Because I heard what you did today. Because you were braver at 8 than I've been at 71. Clover shook her head. That's not a reason, she said. That's an excuse. You didn't come here because of me. You came here because you couldn't carry it anymore. Because every time you looked in the mirror, you saw someone who let a 16-year-old boy get hurt. She met Lorraine's eyes. You came here for yourself, not for Jonah, not for me, for yourself, because you needed to stop feeling like that. The room was absolutely silent. Lorraine stared at the 8-year-old girl who had just cut through 3 years of self-deception with the precision of a surgeon. You're right, Lorraine whispered. You're absolutely right. Clover nodded. I know. Then she did something no one expected. She reached out and took Lorraine Ashby's trembling hand. But that's okay, Clover said, her voice softer now, because it doesn't matter why you came. It matters that you came. It matters that you brought those papers. It matters that you're going to tell the truth. She squeezed the elderly woman's hand. You can't fix what happened to Jonah, but you can make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. And that's worth something. That's worth a lot. Lorraine broke. Completely. Sobs racking her body. 71 years of carefully constructed dignity dissolving in the presence of an 8-year-old girl who understood forgiveness better than most adults ever would. I'm sorry, Lorraine gasped. I'm so sorry. I know, Clover said. Tell Jonah, not me. She let go of Lorraine's hand, stepped back, and looked at Garrett. She's going to help now, Clover said. She just needed someone to tell her she could. Garrett stared at this child, this 8-year-old who had been walking toward a kidnapper's car 12 hours ago, who had made a signal 3 times, who had memorized a phone conversation, who had provided the crucial detail about the river property, who had just talked a 71-year-old woman through 3 years of guilt in less than 5 minutes. He had never met anyone like her. He hoped he never would again, because children shouldn't have to be this strong. The next morning, Special Agent Claire Dunham arrived at the clubhouse. FBI Atlanta Field Office, Financial Crimes Division, 43 years old, practical gray suit, no jewelry, the kind of woman who had been working cases like this longer than she wanted to admit and had the exhaustion to prove it. She walked in without knocking. Mr. Holloway, she said, I'm told you have information relevant to an ongoing federal investigation. Depends on what you're investigating, Garrett replied. New Horizon Youth Services, Warren Prescott, DFCS billing fraud. Dunham's eyes swept the room, took in the file folders, the laptops, the evidence bags containing documents from the river property, and based on the amount of work spread across this table, she continued, I'm guessing you have already done half my job for me. How long has your office known about Prescott? Garrett asked. Dunham's expression tightened. 4 months. We've been building a case. Carefully. By the book. 4 months, Garrett repeated. And while you were building it, an 8-year-old girl was being targeted because her mother processed the audit paperwork that triggered your investigation. Dunham had no good response. The silence confirmed everything. We got her out in 3 hours, Garrett said. You had 4 months. Dunham's jaw locked. But she didn't argue. She couldn't. What do you have? She asked finally. Garrett gestured to Byte, who pushed his laptop across the table. Financial records showing $517,000 in documented theft, ghost placements, fraudulent billings dating back to 2017, personal transfers from a nonprofit operating account, asset purchases including a trailer land and a country club membership. Dunham reviewed the screen. Her expression shifted. This fills gaps we haven't been able to close, she said quietly. We had the billing records. We didn't have the personal transfers or the asset trail. Ironside slid the envelope across the table. Jonah Bridwell's original 2021 complaint, buried by a DFCS supervisor. The supervisor is willing to testify about how it was suppressed. Dunham opened the envelope. Read the first page. Set her pen down. If this is authenticated, she said slowly, it changes the scope of the charges significantly. Garrett leaned forward. We have conditions for cooperation. Dunham waited. Clover Mercer gets a victim advocate assigned before the first interview. Nobody talks to her without her mother present. And the second arrest, Russell Vance, the supervisor who buried Jonah's complaint and threatened Lorraine Ashby last night, That happens this week. Not after another month of paperwork. Dunham looked at Garrett for a long moment, calculating, assessing, deciding. Done, she said. She started to leave, then stopped, because Clover Mercer was standing in the doorway. 8 years old, yellow dress, white sneakers with a sunflower on the left toe, watching the FBI agent with eyes that missed nothing. You knew, Clover said. Dunham turned. I'm sorry you knew about Mr. Prescott for 4 months. You knew he was stealing from children. You knew he was hurting them, Clover, her mother said, reaching for her shoulder. But Clover stepped forward. If you knew for 4 months, she said, why was I still almost kidnapped last week? The question hit the room like a physical blow. Dunham's face went through several expressions. Professional composure, defensiveness, and finally something that looked like shame. Building a federal case takes time, she said. We have to follow procedures, gather evidence, make sure we can prove everything in court. Clover shook her head. Mr. Prescott was going to put me in his car, she said. He was going to drive away. My mom wouldn't have known where I was. Nobody would have known. She held up her left hand. 3 people saw me make this signal before Mr. Holloway stopped. 3 people, and they all kept walking. She looked directly at Dunham. How many children did you walk past while you were building your case? The FBI agent had no answer. How many Jonahs? Clover continued. How many kids who told the truth and got ignored? How many signals that nobody saw? Silence. I'm 8 years old, Clover said. And I know that waiting 4 months while a bad person hurts children is wrong. I don't need procedures to tell me that. She turned to Garrett. I want to write a letter to Jonah, she said. Can you help me? Garrett nodded. What do you want to say? Clover thought for a moment. I want to tell him that someone heard his name, that someone remembered, that what happened to him matters, and that I'm sorry it took so long for anyone to believe him. She looked back at Dunham. Because someone should say that, even if it's just a kid. Then she walked out of the room. Her mother followed. Garrett looked at Agent Dunham, the federal agent who had been building a careful case by the book for 4 months while children continued to be hurt. She just did what you should have done, Garrett said quietly. She asked the question nobody wants to answer. He stood. You've got 48 hours to arrest Russell Vance. After that, we release everything we have to the press. The financial records, the buried complaint, Lorraine Ashby's testimony, all of it. Dunham's jaw tightened. That's obstruction. No, Garrett said. That's accountability, something your office forgot about while you were following procedures. He walked past her, stopped at the door. 4 months, he said. Remember that number, because that 8-year-old girl is going to remember it for the rest of her life. And so is everyone else who hears this story. He left. The clubhouse was quiet after Dunham departed. Garrett found Clover in the small kitchen at the back of the building, sitting at a table meant for 5 people, a piece of paper in front of her, and a pen in her hand. She was staring at the blank page. Need help? Garrett asked. Clover shook her head. I know what I want to say. I just don't know how to start. Garrett sat down across from her. What's the first thing you thought when you heard his name, he asked, that day in the parking lot? When Prescott said Jonah Bridwell, what did you think? Clover was quiet for a moment. I thought he sounded like he was already gone, she said. Like Jonah was already not a person anymore. Just a name, a problem that got solved. She looked up at Garrett. I don't want him to feel like that, like he's just a name, like what happened to him didn't matter. Then tell him that, Garrett said. Tell him exactly that. Clover picked up the pen. She wrote for 10 minutes. When she was done, she handed the paper to Garrett. He read it. Dear Jonah, my name is Clover. I'm 8 years old. I live in Bartow County with my mom. 3 weeks ago, I heard a man say your name. He said it like you were a problem he had already fixed. Like you didn't matter anymore. But you matter. I memorized what he said because I knew it was important. I knew something bad had happened to you. I knew nobody had believed you when you told the truth. I believe you. I don't know what happened to you. I don't know where you are now. But I wanted you to know that someone heard your name. Someone remembered. Someone is fighting for you, even if it's 3 years too late. I'm sorry nobody listened when you tried to tell them. I tried to tell people too, about the man who gave me a weird feeling. They said he was nice. They said he passed background checks. They said I was being silly. I wasn't silly, and neither were you. You were brave. You wrote 14 pages. You told the truth even when nobody wanted to hear it. That matters. You matter. I hope you're okay now. I hope you found people who believe you. I hope you know that what happened wasn't your fault. And I hope someday you can come back. Not to make things right, because nobody can make it right, but to show them that you survived, that you're still here, that they didn't erase you, because you're not just a name. You're Jonah. And I see you, Clover Mercer, age 8 yet. Bartow County, Georgia. Garrett set the letter down. His throat was tight, his eyes were wet. He looked at the 8-year-old girl who had written words that grown prosecutors couldn't have improved. This is perfect, he said. Clover nodded. Can you make sure he gets it, she asked. I'll deliver it myself, Garrett said. Promise, promise. Clover looked at the letter. Then she looked at Garrett. Mr. Holloway. Yeah, when you find Jonah, will you tell him something else for me, anything? Clover was quiet for a moment. Tell him that signals work. That even when everybody walks past, even when nobody seems to see, if you keep trying, eventually someone will stop. She pressed her hand to her chest, the same gesture she had made on the courthouse steps. Tell him his signal reached me. 3 years late. But it reached me, and I'm going to make sure it reaches everyone else too. Garrett stared at this child. This impossible, unbreakable 8-year-old child who had seen the worst of what adults could do and had responded by becoming better than any of them. I'll tell him, Garrett said. Clover smiled, the first real smile Garrett had seen from her since he'd watched her walk across the courthouse square square with a predator's hand around her wrist. Good, she said. Then she stood up, walked to the door, stopped. Mr. Holloway, yeah, thank you, she said, for stopping, for seeing, for not walking past. Garrett looked at the letter on the table, at the 8-year-old girl in the doorway, at everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. Thank you, he said, for making the signal, for not giving up, for being braver than anyone I've ever met. Clover's chin lifted. I'm not brave, she said. I was scared the whole time. That's what brave means, Garrett said. Being scared and doing it anyway. Clover considered this. Then maybe everyone can be brave, she said, if they just stop walking past. She walked out. Garrett sat alone in the kitchen of the Hells Angels clubhouse holding a letter written by an 8-year-old girl to a 22-year-old man she had never met. A letter that would change Jonah Bridwell's life. A letter that would eventually be read aloud in a federal courtroom. A letter that would be reproduced in newspapers across Georgia and eventually across the country. A letter that began with 3 words that contained everything. You matter. Garrett folded it carefully, put it in his vest pocket, over his heart. Tomorrow he would drive to Macon. He would find Jonah Bridwell. He would deliver this letter and ask Jonah if he was willing to tell his story one more time. But tonight he sat in the quiet kitchen and let himself believe what an 8-year-old girl had just proven. That signals work. That some people stop. That it's never too late to start seeing what everyone else has been trained to miss. Garrett reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the river stone Clover had given him on the courthouse steps. He held it out to her. This belongs to you, he said. Clover shook her head. I gave it to you for luck. Some gifts aren't meant to be kept, Garrett said. They're meant to be passed on. You carry this until you find someone who needs it more than you do. Then you give it to them. Clover took the stone, felt its familiar weight in her palm. How will I know when to give it away? You'll know, Garrett said, the same way you knew to make the signal. The same way you knew to trust me. Russell Vance was arrested at 8:47 on a Tuesday morning. He was sitting at his desk in the Bartow County DFCS regional office, reviewing case files that would never be reviewed again, when Detective Nora Kendrick walked through the door with 2 federal marshals and a warrant that listed 17 separate charges: conspiracy to obstruct justice, witness tampering, accessory to fraud, accessory to child endangerment, destruction of evidence, falsification of government records. The list went on. Vance had been a DFCS supervisor for 11 years. He had signed performance reviews and approved placements and attended conferences about trauma-informed care and child welfare best practices. He had a framed certificate on his wall from the Georgia Department of Human Services, recognizing his outstanding contribution to family support initiatives. He had buried Jonah Bridwell's complaint in March 2021. He had accepted $4,200 in cash from Warren Prescott 3 days later. He had threatened Lorraine Ashby 2 nights ago, promising to destroy her pension and prosecute her as an accessory if she talked to anyone about what she knew. He had done all of this while wearing the badge of an agency designed to protect children. When the marshals put him in handcuffs, Vance's face went through several expressions: shock, calculation, and finally something that looked like the beginning of a desperate negotiation. "This is a mistake," he said. "I'm a regional supervisor. I have connections. People will vouch for me. This is all going to ought to be sorted out." Nora Kendrick looked at him with the cold assessment of a detective who had spent 26 years reading guilty men's faces. Warren Prescott said the same thing yesterday, she said. "Right before he found out we recovered his insurance policy on a 16-year-old boy." Vance's expression changed. "I don't know anything about that," he said. His voice was too fast now, too eager. "Whatever Prescott did, I wasn't involved. I was just doing my job, following procedures." Nora leaned closer. "You buried a formal abuse complaint because Prescott paid you $4,200 in cash. You threatened a 71-year-old woman to keep her from testifying. And now you're going to spend the next several years explaining to federal prosecutors exactly how deep this goes." She straightened. "But here's what you should know, Mr. Vance. The 8-year-old girl that Prescott tried to kidnap last Thursday, she's the one who gave us the name Jonah Bridwell. She memorized a phone conversation word for word. She remembered details that led us to the river property where Prescott kept his trophies. She let that sit. An 8-year-old did your job better than you did for 11 years. Think about that while you're waiting for your lawyer." The marshals let him out. Through the office where his colleagues stood frozen at their desks. Through the lobbies where families waiting for appointments watched in silence. Through the parking lot where a single motorcycle was parked at the far end, its rider watching with eyes that had seen too much and would never stop looking. Garrett Holloway watched Russell Vance get loaded into a federal transport vehicle. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to. Sometimes justice didn't require action. Sometimes it just required presence, the knowledge that someone was watching, that someone would remember. Vance looked out the window of the transport as it pulled away. His eyes met Garrett's across the parking lot. Garrett held up his left wrist. The name Ethan caught the morning light. Vance looked away. The transport disappeared around the corner. And somewhere in Bartow County, a 9-year-old boy named Marcus, who had been in the DFCS system for 3 years, felt something shift in the air. He wouldn't understand what it meant until much later. But the system that had been designed to protect him and had failed so many others was finally being held accountable. One arrest at a time. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. Clover Mercer spent the week before it doing something no 8-year-old should have to do. She reviewed her testimony with the victim advocate. She practiced answering questions from lawyers who would try to confuse her. She prepared to face the man who had tried to kidnap her and tell her story under oath. Wren watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. "You don't have to do this, baby," she said on Sunday night, sitting on the edge of Clover's bed while her daughter organized the clothes she would wear the next morning. "Nobody would blame you if you didn't want to testify." Clover looked up from the yellow dress she was laying out. The same yellow dress. Watched impressed. The white buttons replaced because one had come loose during the struggle on the courthouse steps. "I want to," Clover said. "Why?" "Because Jonah testified when he was 16. And nobody listened, nobody helped. And he had to carry that alone for 4 years. She smoothed the fabric of the dress. "If I don't testify, then I'm just like everyone who walked past me on the courthouse steps. I'm just like Mrs. Ashby who read Jonah's complaint and put it in a drawer. I'm just like the FBI agent who knew for 4 months and didn't stop him." She looked at her mother. "I don't want to be like them. I want to be the person who stops." Wren's eyes filled with tears. "You're 8 years old," she whispered. "You shouldn't have to be brave like this." Clover reached out and took her mother's hand. "I know," she said, "but I am anyway. And that's okay, because being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway." She squeezed her mother's fingers. "Mister Holloway told me that." Wren closed her eyes, drew a shaky breath. Your yellow dress, she said finally. You're wearing it tomorrow, Clover nodded. It's my brave dress, she said. I was wearing it when I made the signal. I want to be wearing it when I tell everyone what happened. She paused. And I want Mr. Prescott to see it. I want him to remember what he tried to do. And I want him to know that I'm not scared of him anymore. Wren pulled her daughter into her arms, held her for a long time, and prayed to whatever God might be listening that the world would be kind to this impossible child who had already survived more than most adults ever would. The Bartow County Courthouse was crowded on Monday morning. Local news vans lined the street, reporters with microphones clustered near the entrance. Members of the community who had heard fragments of the story through the gossip network that connected every small town in Georgia filled the public gallery. And at the back of the courtroom, standing in a row along the wall because there weren't enough seats, 17 men in leather vests waited in disciplined silence. Not 113 this time, just 17. The core members, the ones who had been there from the beginning. Ironside with his case files, Gage with his steady presence, Harlan with his counselor's quiet strength, Bite with the financial records that would prove everything, Anvil with his 71 years of grief transformed into something that looked like hope, and Garrett, standing at the end of the row, watching the door, waiting. Warren Prescott was brought in at 9:15. He looked different from the man who had walked Clover toward his car 6 days ago. His frameless glasses were gone, replaced by standard-issue correctional eyewear. His polo shirt and khakis had been exchanged for an orange jumpsuit. His hair, always carefully styled, was flattened on one side from sleeping on a thin mattress. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, already looking for angles. His attorney, a man named Bradley Thornton, who charged $400 an hour and had successfully defended 7 DFCS employees over the past decade, walked beside him with the confidence of someone who believed he could make this go away. Thornton had a strategy. He had spent the weekend preparing it. And when Judge Patricia Hollister called the hearing to order, Thornton stood and executed the first phase. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying the measured authority of a man who had done this many times before. Before we proceed with witness testimony, I need to raise a concern about the reliability of the prosecution's primary witness. Judge Hollister, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and eyes that had seen every defense strategy ever invented, looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. What concern? The primary witness in this case is an 8-year-old child, Thornton said. A child who, by the prosecution's own admissions, was subjected to a traumatic experience on the day in question. A child who claims to have memorized a phone conversation word for word 3 weeks before the incident. He paused. It is well established in psychological literature that traumatic experiences can lead to confabulation, particularly in young children. The mind fills in gaps with details that feel true but may not be accurate. The stress of the situation can cause memory distortion. He turned to face the gallery. My client has served the state of Georgia for 9 years. He has passed every background check. He has received commendations for his work with vulnerable children. And now his entire career, his entire life is being destroyed by the testimony of an 8-year-old who may be suffering from trauma-induced false memories. He looked back at the judge. We request an independent psychological evaluation of the child before any testimony is heard. We believe this is essential to establishing the reliability of her account. The courtroom went silent. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Meredith Calhoun rose slowly to her feet. Your Honor, she began. But before she could continue, another voice cut through the courtroom. Small, clear, unwavering. I'd like to speak. Every head turned. Clover Mercer was standing at the witness bench, even though she hadn't been called yet. Her yellow dress was perfectly pressed. Her white sneakers with the sunflower on the left toe were planted firmly on the floor. Her chin was raised, and her eyes were fixed directly on Warren Prescott. Young Lady Judge Hollister said not unkindly, "This is a formal hearing. You'll have a chance to testify when you're called." I know, Your Honor, Clover said. Her voice didn't waver. But the lawyer just said my memories might be wrong. He said I might be making things up because I was scared. I think I should be allowed to answer that. Judge Hollister studied the 8-year-old for a long moment. In 23 years on the bench, she had seen many witnesses. Nervous witnesses, hostile witnesses, traumatized witnesses who could barely speak. She had never seen a witness ask for permission to respond to a defense strategy before testimony had even begun. She looked at Thornton. She looked at Calhoun. She looked back at Clover. "Approach," she said. Clover walked forward, slowly, deliberately. She stopped 3 feet from the bench, the same distance she had stood from Lorraine Ashby, from Agent Dunham, from everyone who had underestimated her. "The lawyer says I might have made up the phone conversation," Clover said. "He says maybe I was so scared that my brain invented things." She held up her left hand. "This is the rescue signal. Palm out, thumb tucked in, 4 fingers folded over. I learned it from a police officer who visited my school last year. He taught us to use it if we ever needed help and couldn't speak." She demonstrated, slowly, clearly. "On September 14th, I used this signal 3 times on the courthouse steps. 11 people walked past me. One person stopped. His name is Garrett Holloway, and he's sitting at the back of this courtroom right now." She didn't look at Garrett. She kept her eyes on the judge. "I wasn't confused about the signal. I wasn't imagining it. I was making a choice because I knew something bad was happening and I needed help." She lowered her hand. 3 weeks before that day, I heard Mr. Prescott on the phone in the community center parking lot. I was sitting on the steps. He thought he was alone, but I was there, and I heard him say things that scared me." Her voice stayed steady. "He said the audit request came through records. I know who processed it. He said the paperwork goes back through the same office. He said the woman has a daughter, Thursdays. And he said that's why Jonah Bridwell didn't go anywhere." She paused. "I memorized those words because I knew they were important. I repeated them to myself every night for 3 weeks. I wrote them in my journal. I didn't tell anyone because I tried to tell Mrs. Pemberton at the community center that Mr. Prescott gave me a weird feeling, and she said he was a nice man with background checks." Her chin lifted. "I'm 8 years old. When nobody believes you, you learn to collect proof. That's what I did. That's why I remember every word exactly." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Clover turned to look at Warren Prescott, the man who had gripped her wrist hard enough to leave bruises, the man who had walked her toward his car, the man who had spent 9 years stealing from children and hiding evidence of his crimes. "You told me nobody would believe an 8-year-old, she said, "when they were putting you in the police car. You looked right at me and said it. Like it was a promise." She took one step closer. "But I don't need you to believe me. I need you to remember." "I heard you. I remembered. And I didn't look away like the other adults did." She paused. "Jonah Bridwell didn't look away either. He wrote 14 pages. He told the truth. And you buried it yet because you thought nobody would ever find out." Her voice dropped. "But I found out. Because I listened. Because I remembered his name. Because I'm 8 years old and I know that when someone tells the truth, you're supposed to believe them." She turned back to the judge. "I'm not confused. I'm not making things up. And I don't need a psychological evaluation to prove that I know what I heard." Judge Hollister stared at the child in front of her. In 23 years on the bench, she had never seen anything like this. She looked at Thornton. "Mr. Thornton," she said, "your motion for psychological evaluation is denied. This witness has demonstrated more clarity and composure than most adult witnesses I've seen. We'll proceed with testimony." Thornton's face went through several expressions. "Your Honor," he started. "Denied," Judge Hollister repeated. "Sit down." Thornton sat. And Clover Mercer, 8 years old, yellow dress, white sneakers with a sunflower on the left toe, took her place in the witness chair. For the next 47 minutes, she told her story. Every detail, every landmark, every word she had memorized from a parking lot 3 weeks ago. She did not waver. She did not cry. She did not look away from the lawyers who tried to confuse her or the man who had tried to take her. She simply told the truth. And when she was finished, when she had answered every question and survived every attempt to shake her account, the courtroom doors opened. A young man walked in, 22 years old, tall and thin with the kind of frame that suggested years of not eating enough. Dark hair that hadn't been cut in months. Eyes that held too much history for someone so young. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt and work boots that were scuffed from whatever job he'd managed to find in Macon. And in his hand he held a letter, handwritten, folded carefully, addressed to him by an 8-year-old girl who had heard his name and refused to let it be forgotten. Jonah Bridwell had driven 6 hours through the night. He had received Clover's letter 2 days ago, delivered by a man in a leather vest who had explained what was happening and asked if Jonah would be willing to tell his story one more time. Jonah had said yes before the man finished speaking, because for 4 years he had carried the weight of a complaint that nobody believed. For 4 years he had wondered if he had done something wrong, if he had deserved what happened, if the system that was supposed to protect him had been right to look away. And then a letter had arrived, written by an 8-year-old girl he had never met. A letter that said 3 words that changed everything. You matter. Judge Hollister looked at the young man standing in the aisle. Can I help you? My name is Jonah Bridwell, he said. His voice was rough, unsteady, but determined. I'm the person she was talking about, the one whose complaint got buried, the one Mr. Prescott was afraid of. He looked at Clover. And I'm here to tell my story, if you'll let me. The courtroom erupted, voices overlapping, lawyers objecting, the gallery buzzing with shock and confusion. But Judge Hollister held up her hand. The room went silent. Mr. Bridwell, she said, are you prepared to testify under oath? Yes, ma'am. She looked at Calhoun. Is the prosecution prepared to call this witness? Calhoun was already on her feet. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hollister nodded. Approach. Jonah walked forward. His boots echoed on the courtroom floor. Heavy, deliberate. The footsteps of someone who had waited 4 years for this moment and was not going to waste it. He passed Clover in the witness chair. Their eyes met. Clover nodded once. Jonah nodded back. Then he stepped onto the witness stand and raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And he did. For the next 2 hours, Jonah Bridwell told his story. He described the placement that had started in September 2019 when he was 14 years old. He described Warren Prescott's visits to the group home, the way Prescott chose certain children for special attention, the gifts that came first, the isolation that followed, the things that happened when no one was watching. He described the complaint he had filed in March 2021, 14 pages written by hand because he didn't have access to a computer. Every incident documented, every witness named, every piece of evidence cataloged. He described the day Lorraine Ashby had called him into her office and told him the complaint was being set aside, pending additional documentation. Documentation that was never specified. Documentation that was never requested. He described the way Warren Prescott had looked at him the next time they crossed paths. The cold smile. The quiet words that nobody else heard. Nobody believes a 16-year-old foster kid with emotional issues. The same words he had said to Clover on the courthouse steps. Jonah described the insurance policy he had discovered months later when he was old enough to access his own records. $127,000. Beneficiary Warren Eugene Prescott. Insured Jonah Andrew Bridwell. He described the fear that had followed. The running, the hiding, the years of wondering when Prescott would find him and finish what he started. He described the letter that had arrived 2 days ago, written by a girl he had never met. A girl who had heard his name in a parking lot and refused to let it go. He described driving 6 hours through the night because for the first time in 4 years, someone had believed him. When he finished, the courtroom was silent, completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing. Jonah looked at Clover. She was still sitting in the witness area, her mother's hand on her shoulder, her yellow dress bright against the dark wood of the courtroom. 4 years, Jonah said. His voice cracked. 4 years nobody believed me. I wrote 14 pages. I told the truth. And the system buried it. The people who were supposed to protect me walked past like I was invisible. He held up the letter. Then I got this. From an 8-year-old girl. A girl who heard my name in a phone conversation and didn't forget it. A girl who memorized every word because she knew nobody would believe her unless she had proof. He looked at Clover. You did what I couldn't do, he said. You made them listen. You made them see. And you wrote to me even though you didn't know me because you understood something that most adults never learn. His voice strengthened. You understood that when someone tells the truth, you're supposed to believe them. You're supposed to help them. You're supposed to stop walking past and start paying attention. He turned to Warren Prescott, the man who had hurt him, who had buried his complaint, who had taken out an insurance policy on his life. You told me nobody believes a 16-year-old foster kid, Jonah said. You were right. Nobody did. He paused. But an 8-year-old girl believed me, and that was enough. Judge Hollister called a recess. When court reconvened 2 hours later, Warren Prescott's attorney no longer looked confident. The defense strategy that had seemed so solid that morning, the psychological evaluation, the trauma-induced confabulation, the questions about an 8-year-old's memory, all of it had crumbled. Because the prosecution now had two witnesses whose testimony corroborated each other perfectly. Two people who had never met, separated by 6 years and hundreds of miles, telling the same story about the same predator, using the same methods. Thornton approached the bench. "Your Honor," he said, "my client wishes to explore the possibility of a plea agreement." The gallery erupted again. Judge Hollister restored order. "What is your client prepared to offer?" "Full cooperation," Thornton said. "Names, dates, records. Everything he knows about how complaints were buried and who was involved, in exchange for a reduced sentence." Judge Hollister looked at Prescott, the man in the orange jumpsuit who had spent 9 years building an empire of fraud and abuse and institutional trust. "Mr. Prescott," she said, "is this what you want?" Prescott stood slowly. He looked at Clover, at Jonah, at the 17 men in leather vests standing at the back of the courtroom, at the reporters who would broadcast his face across the state within hours. He had spent 9 years calculating odds, weighing risks, making decisions based on what he could get away with. The math had finally caught up with him. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. The plea agreement was finalized 3 weeks later. Warren Eugene Prescott pleaded guilty to 17 federal and state charges: grand theft, wire fraud, child endangerment, attempted kidnap, conspiracy to defraud a government agency, insurance fraud, obstruction of justice. In exchange for his cooperation, the death penalty was taken off the table. He was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. No possibility of parole. Russell Vance, who had buried Jonah's complaint and threatened Lorraine Ashby, pleaded guilty to 7 charges. He was sentenced to 7 years. No possibility of parole. The total amount of fraud documented by federal investigators reached $517,080. Assets seized from Warren Prescott's accounts totaled $412,000. The Airstream trailer, the river property, the country club membership, everything he had bought with money stolen from children who had nothing. The funds were placed in a trust administered by the Georgia Department of Human Services, designated for foster care reform initiatives, named after Jonah Bridwell. On the day of sentencing, Clover Mercer stood outside the federal courthouse in Atlanta, her mother beside her, Garrett Holloway behind her, Jonah Bridwell to her left. Reporters surrounded them. Cameras flashed. Microphones were thrust forward. Clover, one reporter called, "How does it feel to know that your testimony helped put Warren Prescott away for 14 years? Clover looked at the reporter. "It doesn't feel like anything yet," she said. "I'm 8 years old. I don't really understand what 14 years means." She paused. "But I know that for 14 years he can't hurt any more children. And that's what matters." Another reporter pushed forward. "Jonah, what would you say to other children who are afraid to report abuse?" Jonah looked at the camera. "I would say that your story matters," he said, "even if nobody believes you at first, even if the system fails you, even if you have to wait 4 years for someone to listen." He looked at Clover. "Keep telling your story," he said. "Keep making your signal. Eventually someone will stop, someone will see, and everything will change." He held up the letter. "An 8-year-old girl heard my name and didn't forget it. She wrote to me and told me I mattered. And because of her, I'm standing here today, watching the man who hurt me go to prison for the rest of his functional life." His voice cracked. "Your story matters. Don't ever stop telling it." The cameras kept flashing, the reporters kept shouting questions, but Clover turned away from them. She looked at Garrett, the man who had seen her signal on the courthouse steps, who had stopped when 11 other people walked past, who had spent 17 years looking for the child whose signal nobody saw. "Thank you," she said. Garrett knelt, bringing himself to her level. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up, for making the signal 3 times, for remembering Jonah's name." He held out his left wrist. The tattoo caught the afternoon light. "Ethan, March 14th, 2007. "I've been looking for him for 17 years, Garrett said. "Not Ethan specifically, but the child whose signal nobody sees, the one who needs someone to stop." He met her eyes. "Thursday afternoon I found you, and you helped me find Jonah. And together we stopped a man who had been hurting children for 9 years. He paused. That means something, Clover. That matters. Clover nodded. I know, she said. Then she did something that would be photographed by 17 different cameras and reproduced in newspapers across the country. She reached out and touched the tattoo on Garrett's wrist. Gently, carefully, the name of a boy who had been lost 17 years ago. He would be proud of you, Clover said. Ethan, if he could see what you did for me and for Jonah, he would be proud. Garrett's jaw tightened. His eyes were wet. How do you know it? He asked, his voice rough. Because I'm proud of you, Clover said, and I think he would feel the same way. She let go of his wrist. She turned back to the cameras. And Garrett Holloway, president of the Vidalia Hells Angels, veteran of 22 years in the Marines, a man who had lost his son and spent 17 years searching for redemption, stood in front of the federal courthouse and let the tears fall. 6 months later, Clover Mercer stood at a podium in the Bartow County Elementary School auditorium. She was 9 years old now. Still wore yellow on Thursdays, still had the sunflower drawn on her left sneaker, redrawn every few months when the marker started to fade. Principal Caldwell had not asked her to give this presentation. Clover had asked him. She had written a letter 3 weeks ago, carefully, thoughtfully, explaining why every child in the school needed to learn the rescue signal, explaining why it mattered, explaining what had happened to her and to Jonah and to all the other children whose signals had been missed. Principal Caldwell had read the letter twice. Then he had called Wren Mercer and asked if Clover was serious. She's never been more serious about anything, Wren had said. The assembly was scheduled for the following Monday. Now Clover stood at the podium looking out at 300 faces, kindergartners in the front rows, fifth graders in the back, teachers lining the walls, parents who had taken time off work to see what this was about. And at the back of the auditorium, standing in the shadows near the exit, a man in a dark suit instead of a leather vest. Garrett Holloway had come. Of course he had come. Good morning, Clover said. Her voice was clear, strong, the voice of a child who had learned to speak up when it mattered. My name is Clover Mercer. I'm 9 years old and I'm in 3rd grade. She paused. Last September, something scary happened to me. A man who volunteered at my after-school program tried to take me. He told me my mom sent him to pick me up. She hadn't. He was lying. The auditorium went silent. For 11 weeks before that day, he'd been watching me, learning my schedule, figuring out when I would be alone. And on the day he tried to take me, I was really scared. She raised her right hand, but I remembered something I learned from a police officer who visited our school. This is called the rescue signal. She demonstrated, slowly, clearly, palm out, thumb tucked, 4 fingers folded over. You make it when you need help but can't speak. When someone is hurting you and you can't scream. When you're scared and you need someone to see. Around the auditorium, 300 students began practicing the gesture. Small hands mimicking hers. Learning something that might save their lives someday. I made the signal 3 times on the courthouse steps, Clover said. 11 people walked past me. They didn't see it. Not because they were bad people, because most adults don't know what it means. She lowered her hand. But one person saw. A man named Mr. Holloway. He was the 12th person to walk past. But he didn't keep walking. He stopped. He looked. He saw my signal and he understood what it meant. She looked toward the back of the auditorium. He saved my life. Garrett's expression didn't change, but his hand moved slightly, pressing against his chest, over his heart. That's why I'm here, Clover said, to teach you the signal, and to ask you to teach someone else, your parents, your grandparents, your babysitters, your coaches, because someday you might be the person who needs help, or you might be the person who can give it. She scanned the crowd. Pay attention to the people around you, she said. Notice when something seems wrong. Don't walk past because it's not your problem. Because someday you might be the only person who can help someone who really needs it. The auditorium erupted in applause. Not polite clapping, genuine enthusiasm. The sound of 300 children who had just learned something important from someone their own age. Clover stood at the podium and let the sound wash over her. She looked at her mother in the front row crying quietly. She looked at Principal Caldwell, nodding with something that looked like respect. She looked at Garrett Holloway in the back of the auditorium. Their eyes met. Clover raised her left hand, pressed it to her chest. Not the rescue signal this time, just her palm over her heart. The same gesture she had made on the courthouse steps when Garrett had first seen her. The gesture that meant, I'm here. I'm okay. I made it. Garrett nodded, then he turned and walked out of the auditorium. His job here was done. But there were other children out there, other signals being made, other people who needed someone to stop walking past and start paying attention. And Garrett Holloway would keep looking until he found them. That was the promise. That was the legacy. That was everything. 3 years later, on a Thursday afternoon in September, Clover Mercer walked into the Bartow County Community Center for the first time since the day she had been taken from its front steps. She was 11 years old now, 6th grade, still wore yellow every Thursday, still had the sunflower on her sneaker redrawn so many times that she had lost count. She was there as a volunteer. The new director, a woman named Patricia Hernandez, who had been hired after the previous administration was thoroughly investigated and restructured, had reached out to Wren 2 weeks ago. They were starting a peer mentorship program for younger children. Would Clover be interested in helping? Clover had said yes before her mother finished explaining the opportunity. Now she sat in the same room where she had once waited for her mother, where Warren Prescott had studied her patterns and calculated his approach, where she had first noticed the man who gave her a weird feeling and had been told she was being silly. The room was different now. New paint, new furniture, new faces, and sitting across from her, small and quiet and clutching a worn backpack, was a 7-year-old girl named Sparrow Brennan. Sparrow hadn't said a word in 10 minutes. Clover recognized the look. She had worn it herself once. That combination of terror and hope and exhaustion. The face of someone who had been failed enough times to stop expecting anything, but hadn't quite given up yet. Hi, Clover said gently. I'm Clover. I volunteer here on Thursdays. You can talk to me about anything, or we can just sit here. Whatever you need. Sparrow looked at her. Her eyes were dark, guarded, the eyes of a child who had learned not to trust too quickly. Do you know the rescue signal? She asked. Clover's breath caught. Yeah, she said quietly. I know it. Do you? Sparrow nodded. My teacher taught us last month. She said a girl at this school made it famous. Clover smiled. I didn't make it famous, she said. A police officer taught it to me a long time ago. I just used it when I needed to. Sparrow's eyes widened. You're the girl from the story, the one who got taken. Clover nodded. I'm the girl who got saved, she said. There's a difference. Sparrow was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her backpack and pulled out a piece of paper, drew something on it, handed it to Clover. A sunflower, drawn in red crayon. That's on your shoe, Sparrow said. I saw it when you sat down. Clover looked at the drawing, at the careful petals, at the small signature in the corner. Sparrow, age 7. Can I keep this? Clover asked. Yeah. Clover folded it carefully, put it in her pocket, right next to the river stone she still carried everywhere. The one she had given to Garrett and gotten back when he told her that some gifts were meant to be passed on, not kept. Thank you, Clover said. I'll keep it safe. Sparrow smiled, small, uncertain, but real. Clover leaned forward. Can I teach you something? She asked. Sparrow nodded. Clover held up her left hand. This is the rescue signal, she said. Palm out, thumb tucked, 4 fingers folded over. You hold it for 3 seconds when you need help but can't speak. She demonstrated. Sparrow copied her. Carefully, precisely. Perfect, Clover said. Now you know. Sparrow looked at her hand, then she looked at Clover. Does it really work? She asked. Clover was quiet for a moment. I made it 3 times, she said. On the courthouse steps, when a bad man was trying to take me to his car. 11 people walked past without seeing. She paused, but the 12th person saw, and he stopped, and everything changed. She met Sparrow's eyes. It works, she said, but only if someone is looking. That's why we have to teach people. That's why we have to keep making the signal even when it feels like nobody will ever see. She reached out and gently touched Sparrow's hand. Promise me something, Clover said. What if you ever need help, make the signal, even if you're scared, even if you think nobody's watching. Keep making it until someone sees. Sparrow nodded. I promise. Clover squeezed her hand. Good, she said. because someday you might be the person who sees someone else's signal. And when that happens, you have to stop. You can't walk past. You have to pay attention. Sparrow's chin lifted. I will, she said. Clover smiled. I know you will. Outside the community center, the September sun was setting, orange and gold and red bleeding across the skitu, and somewhere on a county road in Georgia, a motorcycle engine rumbled to life. Garrett Holloway sat on his bike in the parking lot of a gas station 40 miles from Vidalia. He had been on the road since morning, no particular destination, just riding, the way he had ridden for 17 years, looking, watching, waiting. His phone buzzed. Text message. He pulled it out. The sender was listed as Jonah Bridwell. Garrett opened the message. Mr. Holloway, I wanted you to know that I started a new job today, working at a youth center in Macon, helping kids who are in the system like I was. The director hired me because she read about what happened. She said she wanted someone who understood what these kids were going through, someone who could see when they were struggling. I told her about you, about how you stopped on the courthouse steps, about how you saw Clover's signal when 11 other people walked past. She asked me what made the difference, why you stopped when nobody else did. I told her it was because you were looking, not just walking through the world with your eyes on your phone or your mind on your problems. Actually looking at the people around you, at the signals they were making. She said that's what she wants me to teach these kids, how to look, how to see, how to stop walking past. So that's what I'm doing. I'm teaching them because of you and because of Clover, and because an 8-year-old girl heard my name in a parking lot and didn't forget it. Thank you for believing me when it mattered. Jonah Garrett stared at the message for a long time. Then he opened the folder on his phone labeled Ethan. 17 years of memories, case files, photographs. And now at the bottom, new entries, a text from Ren Mercer. She's doing better. A photograph from the school assembly. Clover at the podium teaching 300 children. A newspaper clipping. Local girl's testimony helps convict foster care predator. And now this, a message from Jonah Bridwell. Thank you for believing me. Garrett saved the message, closed the folder, started his bike. The engine roared to life. The rumble vibrated through the evening air. He pulled out of the gas station parking lot, onto the county road, into the gathering darkness. He didn't know where he was going, he never did. But he knew why he was riding. Somewhere out there, another child was making a signal. Another person was walking past without seeing. And Garrett Holloway would keep looking until he found them. That was the job. That was the promise. That was Ethan's legacy and Clover's gift and Jonah's hope. And everything Garrett had learned in 17 years of grief transformed into purpose. The road stretched out ahead of him, dark and empty and full of possibility. And Garrett Holloway rode into the night, searching for the signal that nobody else could see. Because somewhere out there, a child was waiting. And this time someone would stop.